They say back to basics, keep it fair. Just a warm, dry home away where rent jumps yearly, no apology. Ay, market adjustment theology. They say be grateful, smile, behave. While landlords get another tax break, we're going back to basics. That's the line they always say. Can't afford the rent in Auckland, can't afford it anywhere. Power bill spikes in winter, insurance doubles overnight, and they call it personal responsibility when the lights won't stay on at night. Insurance says flood zone, sorry mate. Premiums up, blame climate fade. Petrol's to something, pushing 3. Pay to get to work, don't you see? They say competition keeps prices low. Funny, only one power company where I go. We're going back to basics, but the basics cost your soul. Can't afford the petrol, can't afford the power, can't afford to fill the trolley full. They say just shop around, say budget smart. When countdown pack and say new world on the card. This isn't living beyond our means, it's living inside a rigged machine. Childcare costs more than the weekly pay. EC fees eat the wage away. Work to pay someone else to raise your kid. Tell me what part of this is choice exactly? A breakthrough high, power too high, fuel too high. Childcare, you're dreaming. They say infrastructure takes some time. Say trust the process, say you'll be fine. Say tighten belts, say don't complain, while MPs get theirs indexed for pain. We're going back to basics, that's a slogan on repeat. Can't afford to be sick, can't afford a week off eat. They say this is just economics, say everyone pays their share. Funny how the basics vanish.
I think I might know where the problem's there. Thank you there, Alex, for letting me know that. My computer changed which microphone I was using. Okay, so those on TikTok have already heard it, but those on YouTube haven't. While Laura's actually having microphone issues, I have the wrong settings that have been put on there, but that's all good. That's all good. So we'll kick off with the now. The bill is the earthquake-prone building. First reading, we will get to see Chris Pink in action, and fingers crossed, Laura will be with us very soon.
4.
Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill, first reading.
Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you. I present a legislative statement on the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill.
That legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the Parliament website. Honourable Chris Pink.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Transport and Infrastructure Committee to consider the bill. Madam Speaker, the earthquake-prone building system aims to prevent loss of life and injuries by requiring earthquake-prone buildings, or EPBs, to be identified and remediated within set timeframes. However, the system has failed to target the nation's resources, both public and private funds, to target the most truly high-risk buildings, with over 8,000 buildings caught up in the regime since its inception as 2017. However well-intended those changes were at the time, of course, following the tragedy that was the earthquakes in Canterbury with significant loss of life. Nevertheless, it's appropriate for us to observe in 2025 that the rules have placed significant costs onto building owners and communities. Madam Speaker, before I proceed further with a bit of the detail of the bill by way of its explanation at the first reading, I do want to acknowledge a very pleasing level of bipartisanship within this House, and obviously I don't prejudge what the other parties will say, but certainly up until this point we've had really good dialogue with interested parties, by which I mean political parties in central government, but also local government's been a really important partner in changes. Indeed, the idea of reforming the system, and certainly to have legislated a pause in the enforcement of the current regime, actually came from local government first of all. So as territorial authorities and as the regulator, but also of course oftentimes as owners of many of these buildings throughout New Zealand, both the large cities and rural regional communities alike, I do want to acknowledge their work, their partnership, along with the expert review panel with a broad range of interests, stakeholders, experts and affected parties such as owners. Madam Speaker, the Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill will refine the existing earthquake-prone building provisions in the Building Act 2004. This bill replaces what is known as Subpart 6A currently of Part 2, and it updates relevant and related parts of the Act, making consequential changes to the regulations to ensure a more consistent and effective system. Madam Speaker, these amendments support the government's wider goals of improving regulatory quality and helping to deliver more affordable housing to Kiwis in the case of residential type structures. I will now outline the key changes contained in the bill. They cover 4 areas. 1, refocusing the EPB system on high-risk buildings and medium and high-risk zones. 2, removing the use of earthquake ratings, the current percentage new building standard or NBS system, and detailed engineering assessments. 3, reducing barriers to remediation, and 4, providing more flexibility for building owners. In terms of that first category, Madam Speaker, to focus the EPB system on high-risk buildings and medium and high-risk zones, I'll point out, as you would expect from that description, we're narrowing the scope of the system. Only 2 types of buildings will remain within the system. That's buildings designed before 1976 that are 3 stories or higher and built from heavy materials like concrete, and unreinforced masonry buildings such as those made of brick. These are the buildings most likely to cause harm in an earthquake, and they must be in medium or high risk seismic zones. And of course, high risk and medium, and for that matter, are relative terms, but of course there are many dangers to the built environment and the hazard exposed nation in which we live. The identify at any time pathway, as it's known, is also being narrowed because currently too many buildings have been identified as EPBs using this avenue or pathway, but there will still be an ability to capture buildings akin to the CTV building in Christchurch. Obviously we're familiar with the tragic consequences of a collapse of a building that would not necessarily be captured by the rules in the traditional way. These are newer, heavy material buildings, those designed after 1976 but completed before 2027, that pose a high risk. These can only be designated earthquake prone with the approval of the Chief Executive of MB. Buildings of this type that have already been designated as earthquake prone will retain that status. Madam Speaker, the bill also updates the seismic hazard zones. Coastal Otago, including Dunedin and Stewart Island, will become a medium seismic zone, updating our understanding of the current scientific reality regarding seismic risk. But existing remediation deadlines and identification timeframes will not change. In lower risk areas, again emphasising that's a relative term, such as Auckland, Northland and Chatham Islands, will no longer be considered earthquake prone from the day of royal assent. These areas are further from plate boundaries or major faults, and the faults that do exist often move very slowly or haven't ruptured in a long time, making strong earthquakes much less likely to occur. I've heard Auckland's volcanic field mentioned by some stakeholders, but studies do show that the rate of seismicity there is still low compared to other volcanic regions in New Zealand. Other out-of-scope buildings that are not the required or specified building types will be identified by territorial authorities with help from MB and removed from the system by 1 July 2027. For buildings that remain earthquake-prone, on the other hand, territorial authorities, basically your councils, will determine the required remediation measures in accordance with the updated EPB methodology, issue updated EPB notices, and keep the register up to date. Finally, we're tightening the definition of priority buildings. From now on, only those that could fall onto a busy street or block a strategic transport route will qualify. Buildings that were priority previously simply because of their use, such as hospitals or fire stations, will lose that status and their deadlines will be updated accordingly. These changes mean clearer rules and a stronger focus on the buildings that matter most for public safety. Moving now, Madam Speaker, to the second category, removing the earthquake ratings and detailed engineering assessments. We'll also be changing how we assess earthquake-prone buildings to make the process more streamlined. We're removing earthquake ratings, commonly known as the percentage of new building standard, or NBS, and detailed seismic assessment. The process for identifying new EP buildings will be simpler and therefore less expensive, with either an engineering evaluation or evidence and information to be provided by the building owner. This approach also disincentivises repeated seismic assessments in search of a different, more favourable NBS percentage rating. Once the territorial authority has the necessary information, it will decide whether the building is earthquake prone, determine any remediation requirements, issue an updated EPB notice and update the register. These changes mean faster decisions, less complexity and a stronger focus on public safety. Moving now, Madam Speaker, to removing barriers to, or reducing barriers to remediation. We're introducing a tiered approach to remediation measures. Requirements will range from risk notification only through to targeted retrofits for heavy construction buildings to facade security or full retrofits for unreinforced masonry buildings. Again, think brick buildings. For smaller unreinforced masonry buildings, those of 1 or 2 stories outside urban centres, no remediation will be required and they won't need to display an EPB notice either. However, they must undergo facade securing if they wish to have their EPB status removed. Moving now finally to the subject of flexibility for building owners, we're introducing more flexibility in terms of deadlines. Owners can apply for extensions of up to 15 years, even if their original deadline had already expired before commencement. Territorial authorities must have regard to factors like ownership structure, the type of remediation required, steps already taken, and whether the building is a priority building. Conditions can be imposed to manage risk, and failure to comply with those conditions could mean that the extension is revoked. This bill is also making it easier to get a consent for seismic work and helping to reduce the cost of that work. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Canterbury earthquakes, as referenced previously, recommended that the Building Act be amended to enable building consents to be issued for strengthening works without requiring compliance with disability access and facilities provisions, as nearly as is reasonably practicable. If the work only relates to the necessary seismic work, authorities must allow it without requiring full compliance with fire safety or accessibility provisions, provided that the building remains at least as compliant as it was before. Similarly, if a building changes its use, it will only need to meet its earthquake-prone remediation measure, not a higher requirement. These changes mean more practicable and cost-effective solutions, more time to comply and fewer barriers for owners committed to making their buildings safer and thereby saving lives. In summary, Madam Speaker, because of the significance and interest in this bill, I'm looking forward to a full 6-month select committee process. The measures in this bill will reduce the number of current EPBs by around 55% and ensure that the remaining buildings require more cost-effective remediation. By prioritising highest risk buildings and adopting more efficient approaches, remediation will be able to be completed faster than under the previous regime. Overall then, these changes are expected to deliver around $8.2 billion worth of savings to the economy and the community, more importantly, and ensure that the most dangerous buildings can be strengthened to protect New Zealanders. Accordingly, Madam Speaker, and with due appreciation for the cooperation around the House already seen in relation to this legislation, I commend it to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Ardena Williams.
Madam Speaker, thank you.
Sorry, your audio is now working.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
I can hear you perfectly fine. Can the audience hear me?
Yeah, I mean, I can hear you. I got a new microphone, so I still need to sort out the mixing for it. Yeah.
No,
okay.
that feeling very well.
Yeah. I just ran out of time to really sit down and troubleshoot it.
Oh, yep, I know that thing. Oh, and not sure if you'll realise of it, but I've got Windows updates pending for update tonight.
Oh, okay.
So
anyways,
your computer may have the same thing.
Oh, fuck. Okay, do you want to start first on the response?
Okay, so basically from what's been gathered on there is the fact that they're changing the Earthquake Building Act to basically remove certain areas that are just completely unrealistically in zones such as Northland, Auckland and the Chatham Islands. Chatham Islands doesn't tend to have skyscrapers there, whereas Northland and Auckland aren't on fault lines. They're in volcanic ash territory. Also, it is bringing Otago is going to become medium risk, And it's also going to remove the National Building Standards earthquake ratings and detailed seismic assessments, replacing with a simpler assessment and reduce costs and delay, and tighten the priority building standards to that could collapse on busy streets or critical transport routes, not hospitals or fire stations by default, and also introducing tiered remediation ranging from warning notices to full strengthening depending on the risk. Allow deadline extensions up to 15 years, even for already expired deadlines, and reducing consent barriers by allowing seismic strengthening without triggering full fire safety or accessibility upgrades. Government claims around 55% fewer buildings in the EPB system, and would be an estimated between $8 and $9 billion savings across the board.
Okay, so was that yeah, okay. So was that from your own notes or was that from ChatGPT? What was that?
That summary of what was said, that was a summary of the Hansard. But yes, ChatGPT has sat there and done that, but that was based on the summary of the Hansard of what was said in the speeches.
Yeah, because I know with some of these chatbots, you can actually just put in the Riz. I haven't done that. I actually read the Riz. So I'll go over what I wrote.
And I only chucked that in because of the issues at the starting off. It's like, oh, heck, I need some facts.
Yeah, because there's a lot there. But yeah, this is not as shiny of a bill as Chris Pink would like it to sound like. So I'm just going to break it down. So in the Riz, right, multiple options were considered. Having looked over those options, I personally was in favor of option 1. That's not the option Chris Pink has gone with, but option 1, the first option, for example, would have saved $2.4 billion. So that's from $10.9 billion, that's the current cost, down to $8.5 billion, without increasing the life safety risk from the status quo. So the option that Pink has gone with is the most cost efficient, but it's going to increase life safety risk by up to 30%. And it was favored over option 1 because it saves $8.2 billion. So option 1, which is basically improving the status quo, was stated in the Riz as being simple to implement, as there is little change, and retains reliance on the percentage of NBS methodology. So that's new building standards. It wouldn't get rid of that. So it also makes no change to the number of earthquake or EPBs. Now, EPB stands for earthquake
building standards.
No, that would be B. EPB. I've got the acronym here. What it stands for. God, I hate it when they do that.
I know when they're talking some technical jargon. Yeah, it does get a little bit frustrating.
Anyways, let me just double check what that stands for before I carry on. EPBs. Yeah, earthquake-prone buildings. There we go. Earthquake-prone buildings. So when I say EPB, guys, I'm referring to earthquake-prone buildings. Okay, so it makes no changes going back to option 1. It makes no change to the number of earthquake-prone buildings in the system. Removing earthquake-prone buildings and low seismic zones from the EPB system is viewed as proportionate evidence-based adjustments. While strong earthquakes can still happen, they're much less likely to occur in any given year, sometimes only once. I'm really frazzled tonight, guys, because I've had a lot of disruptions today.
You're doing well.
Yeah, sorry. I often get aware of the time, and you want to move on to the next speech, and it's that's.
We usually take 20 minutes on the first one anyway.
Yeah, because
I've had a look at the archive footage, and it seems to it's like first one's always 20 minutes, and then suddenly they're in 10-minute blocks.
Yeah, I mean, because it's the one you've got to unpack because everyone's responding to it. So, yeah, removing earthquake-prone buildings and low seismic zones from the EPB system, that's the option that Chris Pink wants to go with, is cited by the Riz to be proportionate in evidence-based adjustments. While strong earthquakes can still happen, they're much less likely to occur in any given year, sometimes only once every few hundred years or even a few thousand years. So here's the problem. Okay, here's the problem with that assessment. The issue is that it is currently not possible to make deterministic predictions of when and where earthquakes will happen. For this to be possible, it would be necessary to identify a diagnostic precursor. So it's a characteristic pattern of seismic activity or some other physical, chemical, or biological change, which would indicate a high probability of an earthquake happening in a small window of space and time. So, so take, for example, volcanoes. You know,
Yes.
there's ways you can measure whether or not a volcano eruption is going to happen. We don't have that with earthquakes.
No, that's so true. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's a potential flaw there with the amendment. And something else that I looked into is that rising sea levels and snow melt due to climate change. There's been an increased amount of evidence showing that this may actually increase the amount of pressure on tectonic faults, which can actually lead to changes in seismic cycles. So, for example, seasonal new and water loads. My dyslexia is really killing me today, guys. Intense rainfall events are suggested to drive annual fluctuations in seismic activities in parts of California, Japan, and the Himalayan seismic zones. So the potential impact on climate change on earthquake-prone buildings in New Zealand, this was not analysed in the RIS. Also not adequately considered in the RIS is the impact that the minister's preferred option will have on the elderly and the disabled, as emphasis was put on immediate economic benefits of amending the legislation. So you'll see that if you listen to that back on that speech again, and unfortunately I was late, which is why I'm a bit frazzled dazzled. But if you go over what he was talking about, a lot of it was about immediate economic benefits, not about it. Like the RIS, like the option he put forward to the RIS to be analysed didn't really take into account potential impacts of climate change. And I was quite surprised when I read through the RIS. It didn't really take into account the impact that these changes are going to have on the disabled and the elderly, especially considering we've got an aging population.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword on that particular one. When you're doing that, is like retrofitting for accessibility does have its own risks that go with it. And I mean, this is a good example is Wellington train station. Heritage New Zealand vetoed putting an accessible ramp for the stairs at the front of from the Bay Street entrance of the station, because it played around with the facade, which means if you were someone with accessibility needs, you either had to loop around the west of the station and come in by the bus terminal, or loop around the east of the station and come in by platform 10 where the bus replacements are, because you couldn't go up the front steps. I think that has now been resolved, but that was a battle that went between Heritage New Zealand and went through and Wellington train station, because Wellington train station, with the help of GW, we're pushing for the accessibility part because it's a train station.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff, like, you know, the impact that these changes are going to have on disabled people. Like, what really gets me is that the risks, you know, that 30% increase. I'm questioning now which population is that? Is that disabled people? Because we're talking about buildings like hostels and you know, large apartment buildings and things like cities. So, you know, so currently at the moment, when a building undergoes alterations, it must be brought as reasonably as practicable to current building code standards in areas such as seismic resilience, fire safety, access facilities for disabled people. So the ministers, so that's Chris Pink, his preferred option is going to remove the requirement for additional fire and accessibility upgrades when a building is being remediated to its statutory requirements. So any kind of new upgrades for disabled people, like you know, okay, we need like new ramps and stuff, and a lot of that stuff just you don't have to really consider it.
It's definitely concerning, especially if it's, say, you know, we're losing say fire exits, or say you have a building which has X number of apartments, and say 20 years ago you might have been able to get away with building one lift, now you have to have two. That sort of thing that might cause problems in the event of emergency, especially considering many of those lifts, yes, they might fit 12 people in there, but they might only fit one person in a wheelchair. You wouldn't possibly be able to fit two in the event of an emergency.
Correct.
And I mean, some of those lifts are freaking hideous. Like you can't even turn a trolley around in it.
Yeah. The other part of this bill that really concerns me is that 1 to 2 story unreinforced masonry buildings in small towns, so that's, like place I'm living in, will not need to display an EPB notice. So earthquake prone building notice. That to me,
and I'm used to seeing those all across Wellington.
yeah, I mean, that to me is a bit concerning. And the fact that basically it's not, what is it doing? It's basically not taking into account rural communities and the fact that, earthquakes do happen there. People need to know if they're standing next to a building that is earthquake prone. Could it fall on top of them? If I have like a market stall outside one of those buildings and a big earthquake hits, I don't have the information on the building to tell me whether or not, it's a safe building to take shelter under.
And what type of sticker it's got, whether it's got a white notice, a yellow notice, or a red notice.
Yeah. So that's a potential safety issue right there. I also have big concerns about what they're doing in Auckland, because what I just said there about climate change, Auckland's got a rising sea level. It's still prone to earthquakes. It still gets earthquakes. I know the claim here that engineers tend to over-engineer things, but there's a good reason for it. If you've got climate change, and you've got how long do you want your buildings to last? That's the first question. And also, do you want those buildings to be able to stand up to other things like a tsunami?
Yeah, exactly. Now, for those who are wondering what these notices look like, we'll sit there and show you. So this is Wellington City Council notice of what they look like. So these are the different notices that have on the background. So this is the most common one, which states whether the building is where it's at its minimum standard before it is met as condemned as 15% of code. That's a different one that shows a 70% code. This one is...
So that, by the way, percentage of new building standards, that's not going to be there anymore.
Yeah. This is one where the rating has yet to be determined. So that means it's obviously something has happened, but it hasn't actually quite got through there. This is one about 22% of the national building standard. This is obviously red stickered, which, got to be honest, I've not seen this sign that often in Wellington, but usually those buildings will be barricaded off. So, I mean, that's just an example of what Wellington City Council system uses for their earthquake building, which is probably the best one to actually sit there and look at, considering it's the one probably the most, historically speaking, the most earthquakes, and got probably the best building standards in the country.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that we have an infrastructure deficit, right? And, there's a lot of funding that's going to have to be put forward to get that done. And it's pretty clear to me that this bill exists to try and cut back on much spending as possible to get as much public buildings done as possible, or public infrastructure done as possible. The problem is that it's putting people at risk. That's a big issue there, right? It's going to remove the earthquake-prone building status from 55% of current earthquake-prone buildings. So, and it's going to require the risk notification on earthquake-prone buildings register, rather than the remediation of another 16%. So in total, 70% of current earthquake-prone buildings will no longer be subject to mitigation requirements.
Okay, shall we see what our darling MPs continue off this time with Arena Williams?
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to take this short call on the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill. This is one bill that Labour will support and is really interested to follow through very carefully in the submissions at the Select Committee room, because we know just how this will affect many people's lives very deeply. A number of stakeholders who will be financially impacted by this, either because they are owners of commercial buildings or because they are owners of apartments and homes that are affected by either the old rules or the new. We are also interested in hearing from councils about how these rules will impact regionally, and I'll raise some of those concerns about regional rules specifically with the House later. But Madam Speaker, I just want to explain for the House this decision that Labour wants to support an effective and efficient regime for improving the situation that we have currently, where a useful earthquake-prone buildings regime would mean that there was an incentive for buildings to be remediated quickly and to the highest possible standards that building owners can afford, and that is not necessarily what's happening now. The risk remains the same to New Zealand, and we have to be comfortable that the only sorts of rules that will work here and the only sorts of rules that will be ethical to impose on people are those which can be followed and that the financial cost makes sense for people to comply with. The rules as they currently are, that were set by the National Government in 2014, do not adequately do that, because there are buildings right now on main streets in towns and cities in New Zealand that are not used and still pose a risk, not only to the lives of people around them, but to buildings that they are next to. If we don't have a regime that supports the remediation of those and the redevelopment of those, then we don't have a regime that works for everyone and works for the communities who have to deal with those buildings. And so that's why this is something that we hope to work through carefully, because we want that stronger, fairer and more risk-based earthquake-prone building system. Focusing the regulation on the buildings and regions that present genuine life safety risk is sensible, and that is something that everyone in this House can agree with, that we must have a regime where we can pick the most risky things that have been identified and kept up with not only our understanding of the building science, but the seismic risk around the country, and that we are correctly identifying the things which need to go first. Because if that's also something that we have learnt since 2014, that the things which are causing the most risk to people are not necessarily the things that are being remediated first. In those areas like Christchurch, which have been able to sort of go first and take these issues really seriously, that has been incredibly useful for the region and really good for the region, and some other regions have lagged behind that, and we need to fix that issue in terms of sequencing the timing for this remediation. The current system has also created costs for some owners and councils that haven't been brought out in the actual risk, and this is a positive step to reduce those burdens while still addressing those high risk structures that we all know we need to deal with, because the underlying risk doesn't go away. One thing that we will be listening very carefully to in the Select Committee submissions on this is the government's decision to fully remove Auckland from the regime. This is something that is no surprise to the Minister that I disagree with, and no surprise to the Mayor that I disagree with. Auckland is the country's largest city and the highest population exposure and therefore critical economic infrastructure that is impacted by this. Seismic risk is low, Madam Speaker, but we have built our largest city on an active volcanic field. 700 years ago was a major eruption compared to the last major earthquake, which is 70,000 years ago. When we have major volcanic eruptions, buildings move. People's lives are in danger because of the buildings and the standards. I'm not proposing that we need to deal with every possible risk for buildings in this bill, but this was a proxy for dealing with some of those risks presented by the earth literally moving underfoot and engineering standards not being able to keep up with that. If we don't have seismic risk to stand in for those risks, then what do we have? And it's up to the government to make sure that we have the appropriate kind of regulation which deals with that underlying risk, which does not go away because our regulations no longer deal with it. So we support the more proportionate remediation rules. That's a given. We need to listen to the science around how this will affect our cities. This is a useful position for many of those regions who will go through it, and we look forward to working alongside the government to make sure that we've got the rules and settings right for this.
Mike?
Well, it's interesting what Jason has brought up here about the Christchurch CBD, saying it's been a pretty slow progress, and it is so true, because it does look, now I haven't been through Christchurch CBD, but from the pictures I've seen, it looks quite barren compared to other central business districts.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why it's barren. I don't know if it's related to businesses not wanting to set up there due to earthquake risk, but since we're on the subject of earthquake risk, I like the fact that Ariana brought up the fact that, yes, Auckland is on an active volcanic field, but the other thing that's kind of been overlooked is the fact that we have rising sea levels. We have a warming climate, which, again, like I said before in my previous ramble, that the evidence is growing that increased water, right? So you've got the melting snow caps and you've got increased rainfall, increased water loads, is going to impact seismic activity. And it's already starting to be observed in places like California, Japan, and up in the Himalayan seismic zone, and also other places, like Italy and France, which also have earthquakes because you've got the Alps there. But yeah, these are all very important things to consider. So
we also look at water retention. We just have to sit there and take a look at the what's happened in Te Whārwhiti right up through, all the way through the Bay of Plenty, right up to the top of Coromandel, that has got on through with increased water flow going through the area. As I'm saying, it feels now January is becoming quite a wet month for society.
Yes, you're going to see that with climate change, with New Zealand's going to become wetter and windier. Yeah. So removing back or pulling back some of those infrastructure requirements, I think, is the wrong direction to go. I wouldn't support this bill if I was standing in Parliament, because
Yeah.
I know there's a better option that was already proposed in the RIS that was not considered by the minister. So for that reason, I can't agree with this bill, because there are better options on the table. It's not like this was the best option and he went for it and it happens to have flaws. No, there were other options he could have chosen from. And I encourage everyone to go have a look at that regulatory impact statement, because this is a bill that will impact, if you're a renter, this is going to impact you.
It's a bill itself that is going to go well into the future. It's not something that's likely to be overturned if there is a change of government at the election. This is one that will likely remain in place.
Yes, so it's important that, and I know I've been a bit slack recently about putting in submissions for the select committee, but this is absolutely one worth doing, because we can see in other countries, the impact of a lack of regulations in earthquake zones. You just have a look at places like Tibet and stuff like that when they have an earthquake, or China, the amount of houses that come falling down. We need to have strict standards, especially with climate change and the amount of increase in water and wind, and you got all this pressure on, on infrastructure that's occurring from different angles. It's not just earthquakes. We've got an entire ecosystem that we have to consider. And I think this bill is prioritizing the economy, as in like how much can we save, over human safety. And I don't think that's okay. I think there's a balance that can be reached between the two. Why are we choosing one over the other?
And the other part that's going to actually come in there is, if the building regs don't live up to standard, the insurance premiums go up. And that's the other thing is, so if the building standards don't sit there and bring it into line, the insurance industry comes in doing the correction through increased premiums. And the thing is, if it's not going to increase it for just those that need to be like that, it will gradually increase across the board. I mean, I know when I had a particular, this is when I was living in Kandala, had an insurance renewal came through, and it had a 30% increase out of the blue. Made no sense. I changed insurance companies because of it. Multiple people in Kandala changed insurance companies because I posted online, and quite a few other people looked at their insurance renewals, and multiple of us changed insurance companies because, it made no sense why we suddenly had a 30% increase with state insurance in there, but with AA insurance had our premiums at the old rate. Yeah, this was talking contents insurance. This wasn't talking house insurance.
That's a really good point about insurance, because we can already observe insurance prices going up due to climate change. Climate change is one of the things that they keep citing. So I wonder how this is going to impact older buildings. The insurance is probably going to go up. Is the bank less likely to give out mortgages and whatnot for older buildings?
It's much more difficult to get a mortgage on an apartment building than it does on a standalone dwelling. Typically, I remember one person went to look at it and they wouldn't give him a mortgage more than 50%. He needed 50% equity in order for that to happen. And that wasn't on an earthquake-prone building either. That was just some normal... that was like, he got given an opportunity of landlord selling up, got offered, would you like the first right of refusal? Because, that some landlords do that to tenants. They give their tenants the first right of buying. He looked at it and his bank said, sorry, we do not lend on apartments more than 50%.
Yep.
So that it didn't end up happening. So,
I don't understand why the government is removing requirements for Auckland. Auckland is like, that is one of the last places you want to remove these sort of requirements from, because it's so exposed.
Yeah, and the other thing, yes, it's not on a fault line, but at the same time, it's got the issue is with water drainage.
Well, it's got the fault line next to it. I mean, there's volcanoes there. Yeah,
exactly. And the thing is, and the fact that water is likely to more move buildings up there by soft soil that previously used to be solid than it would be if it was, say, an earthquake. So you'd still have the effects of an earthquake without being near a fault line. And if you have a certain style of earthquake that goes in that rolls, that the rolling part on the softer soils cause a lot more friction and movement.
You got your slips, like what we're seeing up in Tauranga. But, it's like, okay, New Zealand is a temperate rainforest, right? We're very wet. People don't realize that. I think people forget that we're a temperate rainforest. We've got a lot of wetlands. We're surrounded by ocean. We're windy as heck, There's all these different factors that come in. Do you really want to pull back on engineering requirements and whatnot?
Exactly. Let's get on to Mike Davidson. I think this is the first time he's appeared on the Order Paper podcast.
Davidson.
Speaker, thank you. I stand on behalf of the Green Party to take this call. We will be supporting this bill to the Select Committee stage. Having been raised in Christchurch, we always believed that Wellington was going to be the city that was going to be hit by an earthquake. And obviously we had the September 2010 earthquake, and there was no loss of life or buildings that collapsed. Following that, there was a series of stickers that were placed on buildings that some did find confusing, and also people were encouraged to go back into the CBD. Then the 22nd February earthquake hit, and obviously we saw the resulting collapse of buildings and the tragic loss of 185 lives. Following that, over 1,000 buildings were demolished in the CBD, including a large percentage of our heritage buildings. Having myself worked on the ground at the Earthquake Commission, including being inside the CBD cordon in Christchurch, I'm fully aware of the destruction an earthquake can have and the impact on a city for many years afterwards. Coming to Wellington post-earthquake, just looking up actually created a bit of fear. However, I no longer look up and the fear is gone. And I guess it concerns me slightly as time does progress, we start to relax. And so while this bill does make some very sensible amendments to the Act, and it is really important that we focus on the high-risk buildings in the medium to high-risk seismic zones, I really hope that we don't look back in hindsight in the future and regret the relaxing on some of these regulations. In Christchurch, we did lose a lot of heritage, and however, it was thanks actually a lot to some of the grants that the Christchurch City Council made that we were able to stop a lot more from being demolished. And so it does concern me that under this government, with a rates cap and councils being told to stick to what this government believes is core business, that councils will struggle to help save heritage buildings into the future as we look to strengthen many around this country. I think one of the things that I do find rather concerning, I guess, in this bill is the ability to grant extensions of up to 15 years. We all know that the Alpine fault is overdue, and time delayed is a risk I don't know if it's worth risking people's lives on. And so while we need to work through this through the Select Committee stage, I really hope that we look at this and we make sure that the priorities are put in place to ensure that those that are the most high risk, that will create loss of life if there is a severe earthquake, make sure they are prioritised and do not get extensions that will take up to 15 years. We do have concerns about the removal of the provisions for fire escape and disability access. However, we do understand that the provision does add cost and therefore does slow down the strengthening of buildings. And we want to work through this issue during the Select Committee stage to work out actually what is that extra cost and time that is created from the inclusion of the fire escape and disability access provisions. It is very interesting when you do look at that provision, that on one hand, we want to ensure that we do provide buildings that are accessible, that you can escape. But then we want to ensure that they're also strengthened in a timely manner. And it also does not make sense that just because the building needs to have those earthquake strengthening done, that they have to fulfil those obligations, where buildings that do not and still don't have those provisions do not have to meet those provisions. There's obviously an issue within our current system that is allowing a lot of buildings not to fulfil the right type of fire egress and disability access that we should expect from buildings today. So the Green Party will support this bill to the Select Committee, but we believe there's a lot of work to do to make it currently better than what it is. Thank you.
Honourable David Seymour.
Thank you, Madam.
Before we listen to that guy, I'm sure you're eager to hear my response to cousin Mike Davidson. Sorry, Kazi, I disagree. I think when there's a better option on the table, we should absolutely be pushing to get it. I don't support taking this bill to Select Committee. I'm a lot more harsher that way because, like as he pointed out, there are lives on the line, and the risk of non-compliance is higher with the option that Chris Pink has gone with. We could have gone with improving the current system rather than scrapping and amending. I don't get me wrong, I am empathetic to the position he's putting forward, like with Christchurch and whatnot. I get it, but option one is put down in the RIS had flexibility built into it, which would have enabled more cost-effective, so simple strengthening retrofit options for 1 to 2 story buildings. And I like that. I like the fact that, yep, we can save money doing that. I think that's good, but we can also protect lives doing it that way. So for that reason, I can't, I'm going to have to disagree with my fellow Green members that I personally disagree with taking this one to select committee when there are better options on the table that we should be debating for and advocating for. So I have been asked in the past, if someone is wrong or there's someone in the party you disagree with, are you just going to be a sheep and go, yeah, yes, yes, yes? No, of course not. I'm always going to cite what I think about things. I'm always going to bring up, yep, there's a better way to do something. We should shoot for it. Here's my position. Here's the evidence I've got. I don't just blindly say yes to things. That's what I'm trying to say here. I will, if there is something there's something that needs to be disagreed on, and there's a good reason to do so, I will do it.
Yeah, well, actually, that's quite interesting. Not sure if many of our viewers actually do know. There has been a coalition split between the Australian Liberal Party and the Australian National Party. And it's interesting to find out that if you're not in the shadow cabinet, you can vote however the way you want. Whereas if you're in the shadow cabinet, you are meant to vote along party lines.
Well, I'm not split here with the.
No. But
I just have a differing opinion. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just to point out there. The difference between Australia and New Zealand is the fact that you do have a little bit more flexibility when you're not in the cabinet or the shadow cabinet of a political party.
Here's the thing with the Greens: we love a damn good debate, man.
Exactly.
We'll debate till the cows come home. We will debate.
Yeah. As long as it's not name calling.
Yeah, no, we don't do that. But yeah, debates can get pretty intense. Like everyone's bringing out stacks of evidence.
Yeah. That's something I do like about the Greens is they actually bring out their stacks that back it up.
But
even sometimes there's a couple of things they could do. They could not do, such as bring in the Americanization culture wars, like defund the police. But at the same time, they tend to bring up stats that explain, where it can be done better and where it can't be.
Defund the police.
That is a very American-style sort of thing that's out there.
A bit hot take. I really hate that term, defund the police.
Yeah.
I like the term redistribution of funding. So I like giving funding to other organizations that can help deter crime. That's just an example. Where we might disagree is on messaging, but the goal.
Yeah.
The goal is always the same. Like what's the goal here? What's the goal here of this bill? Keep people safe, reduce costs where it is practical to do something. Do so, keep standards up, right?
Yeah.
We both want the same thing, but we've got different perspectives on how that could be done.
Okay, now it's time to eat those nasty vegetables that taste horrible. We've got David Seymour.
Madam Speaker, I rise on behalf of ACT in support of this earthquake-prone buildings amendment bill, and what a journey it has been. Madam Speaker, if I can take you back to the tragic events in Canterbury 15 years ago, it was understandable that members of this House would want to pass a law to protect people and say, never again will we see that kind of tragic destruction. And I stood here in 2016 and watched members of this House pass such a law. But I was the only person to vote against it, 119 to 1. The reason being that I had read the evidence. I read that it predicted we might save 3 lives in Auckland over 10,000 years, or at least that's the best statistics that they could come up with. It was as though the lunatics had taken over the asylum. It was clear that the earthquake strengthening laws of 2016 would devastate communities, would devastate individuals and devastate the New Zealand economy for no benefits whatsoever. And sadly, it is exactly that has come to pass. Madam Speaker, billions of dollars have been spent strengthening buildings. Provincial streets have been empty as buildings were deemed earthquake-prone and could not be used. And people have been personally devastated. There was a story I shared recently of a constituent who visited me and insisted on reading out a letter from top to bottom, with tears in her eyes as she did it, explaining that she had lost her livelihood, her life savings in her early 70s, because when her body corp decided to do some routine maintenance on her apartment that she had saved her life to own freehold, she was told that they had to do earthquake strengthening, and the cost of that ate up all of her savings. There haven't just been personal destruction. There has also been destruction at a national level with all those billions of dollars. These changes today will save $9 billion. And there's a few things we can learn about it. The first thing is that we must be proportional in our response, even when things are emotional, even when things are difficult. This House has the power to impose costs on New Zealand that are devastating. We only need to look at the evidence. Wayne Brown, our mayor in Auckland, a city that will now be exempt from these earthquake rules, he says there hasn't been an earthquake in New Zealand for 200,000 years. And in Auckland, and by the looks of it, Wayne Brown would know. There hasn't been an earthquake for 200,000 years. Madam Speaker, on this, there are fewer than 500 people lost to earthquakes in the history of our country, and yet we lose that many people to heart disease every single month.
What is this argument?
When bad things happen, we must respond in proportion. We must do proper cost-benefit analysis, and we must understand the imposition that we're putting on people and their property before we make rules that can be so devastating.
I'm just going to quickly
Nonetheless,
interject.
after 9 years of waste, of people being devastated, having their houses and their life savings run down, and Chris Pink and this coalition government has returned exactly the things we need: cost-benefit analysis, proportionality and common sense. Auckland and Northland are out. We will no longer have the new building standard that has been so complicated and expensive to calculate, and the focus will be on unreinforced masonry buildings and concrete buildings designed before 1976 that are more than 3 stories high and are in earthquake-prone zones, i.e. not the top of the country where a third of us live. These are the kinds of sensible changes that I said we should have made 9 years ago. It is a tragedy that we did not do that, but the only thing we can do today is restore common sense. And as I look across the House at Duncan Webb and see him wailing and raving, he leaves this House having achieved so little. And to see his frustration is a sweet, sweet satisfaction.
Andy Foster.
Okay, I really wanted to jump in sooner than that, to be honest. I was hoping that you were going to pause halfway. But look, because he's out here going, oh, look, buildings haven't killed people in New Zealand. Yeah, I wonder why.
Because we build them up to good standards. I mean,
because we've got a building code.
Yeah. I mean, if we sit there and look at, say, rail transportation disasters, we've only had one rail incident in the whole time in this country that had deaths that exceeded more than, I think it's 10 people being tangiwai on Christmas Eve, 1954, I think it was.
What I want is for someone to ask David Seymour, how many dead people are acceptable? How many buildings crushing people are acceptable? We've just had the slip up in Tauranga. Is that an acceptable amount of deaths? We've got an amount of earth landing on top of people. Yeah. Well, how many people dying is acceptable?
It's counted at the moment. 6 people are missing from that slip on Mount Maunganui.
Yes. How many missing people are acceptable to you in an earthquake? Like, you know, you've got people saying dumb things like there hasn't been an earthquake in Auckland for 200,000 years. I'm like, that is wrong. That is wrong. There are earthquakes up there. The most significant earthquake that occurred up there was actually back around the 1800s, but there's been little earthquakes and whatnot all throughout there. And for anyone that comes from like China or a Southeast Asian country, a place where they don't have the same standards of, you know, for building stuff, right? And it shocks me that David Seymour even brought this up because he's an engineer. You know, he should know about why engineers over-engineer stuff is because they're held liable if something goes wrong, like a building landing on top of someone's head, okay? That is the reason why people tend to over-engineer stuff. And also, like I said before, Auckland is prone to other things, right? Flooding, slips. It's built on top of volcanic activity. I know there hasn't been a volcanic explosion in like 200,000 years. Maybe that's where the confusion's coming from. But these things can still happen. Wind is a thing, right? If anything, the earthquake strengthening legislation will help to buffer against things like rising water, right? At least at least there is something there, okay? Because the last thing you want is a building sliding down the road.
I can envision that happening in my head as something that might have come from a Bugs Bunny cartoon or something that the Simpsons would have.
like, yeah, I mean, like the other point that David Seymour brings up is like, oh, okay, yeah, earthquake facilities, fatalities, less than 500 historically. We can compare that to monthly heart disease deaths. Don't you want to minimize death across the board? Like, what are you saying that?
Like, you know, needless deaths. But I mean, they're the ones who sat there and basically, I mean, not David Seymour in particular, more Brett Van Velden has sat there and mentioned that we put too much value onto the cost of life over the COVID response. And that's when you're dealing with someone who has that mindset and considers their worldview as common sense. It's like sitting down there dealing with a brick wall.
Well, I mean, here's a question for David Seymour. How many deaths are acceptable to you? What percentage of people dying is fine?
Yeah.
You know, we've got an aging population. How many children dying from a building landing on top of them is okay in your book? How many disabled people dying is okay in your book? Like, you know, because it's the vulnerable that end up getting killed in these situations. Children, disabled, elderly. How many people how many people in those demographics is okay to die?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I just want to quickly respond to a comment about police defunding. I agree. This wasn't said by the Greens. This was attributed to us by some right-wing lobby group. We didn't say that. Tamitha did say abolish the police, but she was referring to distributing funding across different organizations that can help lower down the rate of crime. So looking at things like Māori wardens and stuff like that, and community programs and iwi programs, and you know, other things.
Making sure people are actually receiving the social security assistance that they're entitled to is a great example that can sit there and lower crimes.
And then one more. Is it just me or right-wing libertarianism is quite autistic? Brain, sorry if I use a bad analogy. I mean, is it autistic? Well, I mean,
Liam would have probably, I'm not sure about now because he's had more life experience, but at 18, he would have sat down there and raved. I know he didn't rave about David Seymour because he realised ACT was garbage. But he would be sceptical to follow some of those logics at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm autistic. I have what was used to be called in the past Asperger's syndrome. So, and I used to be an ACT supporter. So for me, what attracted me to that party was the simple sloganing. Really, it's like, oh, complex problem, simple solution. You know, but then when you start looking into data and you start reading up on the background of things and how mechanisms work and how stuff like that, you know, it very much appeals to the autistic brain because it's like it's almost like they try to have a simple engineered solution to the problem, you know?
Yeah. They're not realising every situation is complex and it is not clear cut from one case to another. You know, every situation can have various different variables. That's something I've learnt from running my business is you could try to prevent problems till the cows come home. Some people will somehow still fall themselves into that trap of a problem occurring.
Yeah, right? You're absolutely right to point out there is a difference between simplicity, and I think where the left wing gets it right is understanding the nuance, which is why I'm a left wing libertarian, because it's like you got to look at the nuance. Like for example, you know, you look at private property rights versus something like, for example, the example I gave the other week was, okay, I have personal property rights. Can I fire off fireworks at 3 a.m. in the morning and impact my neighbors and impact the native birds that live near me and impact the livestock and impact, you know, can I do that?
And the other thing that also I think you brought up was a gun range opening up next to a chicken farm. Yeah, you know. So that's something that, you know, you had mentioned in there, and it's also the one of like, well, who was there first? You know, sort of thing as well. Yeah.
So that's the nuance part that you got to take into consideration, which I think the ACT Party doesn't do a very good job of doing. That I've having read over their bills, having listened to their arguments, it's all very simple solutions to complex problems. Unfortunately, in reality, things don't really work like that. There is no simple solution that you can engineer up to solve a problem that has many complex aspects to it.
I can tell you. So when I had appendicitis, I was what was meant to be a 1-hour operation. Now, sometimes when you have an operation, was meant to be a simple operation with nothing to go wrong. And that was what I expected. When they started operating on me, they found the appendix was twisted and was trying to fuse itself to my bowel internally.
Mm-hmm.
So what turned from being a 1-hour surgery turned into a 2.5-hour complex surgery that they managed to still deliver under keyhole, which was not expected. And a good chunk of the surgical department found out about my case because it was the unusual case of the day. Because they were trying to, because they go like, what the hell happened here? How the hell does the appendix twitch? Like, they're going for all these scenarios because I was knocked out or still was in that 12 hours of recovery. The following morning, we started delving down quite a few things and actually got some more sensible answers. But that's an example of what was meant to be a routine, simple surgery turned into a complex, fast thinking, how the hell do we solve this problem while the person's under the knife at theatre at the time?
Now apply that to buildings.
Yeah.
So have a think about it. You've got this building, you've pulled back the earthquake strengthening requirements because you go, okay, this place is low risk. What happens?
Yeah.
And then you end up with other issues like wind and flood. Oh, whoops, we've lowered our building standards.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on to Uncle Andy, considering he seems to keep appearing on our show.
It's also been well consulted on, and actually that's not the norm in this place. And it's really good, actually, that we do have a piece of legislation that not only was the previous piece of legislation effectively put on hold for a while,
he's not
say,
wrong.
hey, we're going to consult on this new piece of legislation or the wraparound around that, and then come up with a bill. That's actually a really good way of doing business, and we should do that much more often. Madam Speaker, the focus of this bill is about risk to life, and I just pick up the points which were made about the new building standard, the MBS standard, which has been a bit of a bane of many, both property owners but also councils, because it seemed to be so arbitrary. And I think there really was a loss of confidence in the MBS standard. I mean, you could have a building that one day was 85% of the new building standard, and the next day somebody else did an assessment and it's suddenly down to 15, and you went from being, I'm absolutely fine, the market loves it, to people want to get out of my building and I've got to strengthen it at great cost. So that didn't give people any confidence whatsoever. The other thing was around the insurance industry. Now, the insurance industry was quite clear. They said that you can do all the strengthening you like to save lives, but if it doesn't make sure the building's not going to be damaged, it doesn't give you any benefit whatsoever. And I can remember in this city, a brand new building, base isolated building, and the developers of that building, who are probably one of the best developers in the country, saying the insurance companies gave them absolutely no credit whatsoever for building a building of that standard. The insurance price was still the same, so it didn't give them any benefit whatsoever. Madam Speaker, this bill is about removing some of the lower risk areas, and Wayne Brown's already been mentioned. He'll be pleased that Auckland is excluded, as well as Northland and the Chatham Islands. Removing some of the smaller centres, I see that the number there is 10,000 population. I think there might be some submissions for some places. I think Fielding, for example, which was a population of 17,500. I can remember the Manawatu Council being most distressed about the cost of having to fix those buildings because it's a community that just cannot afford to do it. So there might be some argument about what a small centre represents, but removing some of the small centres and also removing lower risk buildings. I mean, the idea that you can have an earthquake-prone wooden building of a single story and you have to go and strengthen that seems to me to be slightly nuts. So it is focusing now on the most high-risk buildings, and that's the sensible way to go. But Madam Speaker, having said all that, changing the rules, as we've already heard from, I think it was from Marina Williams, does not change the risk. The risk is a real risk to whatever level it might be, regardless of what rules we make. The risk remains. The question is about what is the acceptable risk, and we've already heard the argument that says that we haven't had a death in Auckland from an earthquake for 70,000 years plus. There weren't any people there at that point anyway. But the question is, what is an acceptable risk? Is low risk acceptable risk? We accept risks all across our lives in all sorts of different areas. Is the cost of fixing these things in some places an acceptable cost? And what this bill is proposing, it says, actually, no, it's not. Some of those costs of fixing those risks, and the risk is real, but the risk may be low. But if the cost is too high, then perhaps we shouldn't be incurring the cost. We've heard the comments around the Canterbury earthquakes, which is obviously a huge tragedy for people, also a huge amount of damage done to the city itself. Wellington's always taken earthquake strengthening very seriously because we've expected to have a major quake in this place. And how you model how many people will die in a quake like that, I have no idea, because we're guessing. It's the reality we'll be guessing. But you think about that, you look at the NEMA numbers that we've been given. Wellington, I think the Wellington Fault has a 5% chance of going in the next 50 years. The AF8, the Alpine Fault, has a 75% chance of going in that period of time. So you think about what the risks might be in different parts of the country and respond to those risks. Madam Speaker, just to finish off, there are huge costs in the existing regime. And I wanted to reflect the comments that Honourable David Seymour said. We've had comments, I've dealt quite a lot over the years with inner city Wellington, which represents inner city businesses and residents in Wellington. And there are stories about people who are literally trapped in their houses. They cannot strengthen. The cost of strengthening those buildings is as much as the value of the house in the first place. In other words, effectively, they are left with something that is worthless or they can't get out of it. And that is absolutely tragic. And there's also the issue they raise about retrospectivity. The current model says if you change, if somebody goes and reassesses or you change the rules, suddenly my building, which yesterday you said was fine, no longer is. Usually we would say that's retrospective, and that's effectively what those people have been exposed to. Madam Speaker, just to finish off with, what this also does is it will make the strengthening process less expensive. It will remove the requirement for disability access or fire codes to be triggered by that process. But I do have a couple of quick questions to finish with. Can councils rely on existing assessments? Because that's an expensive process to go through. Many have done that. Can councils rely on existing consultations on priority routes? Again, some of them have done that. And can councils give the issue of extensions, and I will finish there. I look forward to considering
Thank you.
Select Committee.
Dan Bidwell.
And Andy actually has been quite experienced in that as being a councillor and mayor of Wellington across between two positions across over 30 years. And inner city Wellington, that is something they constantly have, go to help building owners. I do know that the apartment building Andre's in, the earthquake strengthening bills, the body court fees are close to 20 grand a year at the moment in order to bring the building up to code per dwelling.
Yep.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of money. Like, that's effectively like, if you're on a pension, on a single person on the pension, if you're on a single person on the pension, that's about 80% of your pension per annum.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I agree with the premise of the argument that Andy Foster put forward. No issues there. Like, I get it. We have areas where you haven't had an earthquake in, like, I don't know, hundreds of years or whatever, like a big catastrophe, a big earthquake that flattens everything. And, people are really struggling financially. I do get it, and I am sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
However, the solution that Chris Pink has put forward, I don't think is adequate, and I don't think it's responsible to go forward with it because it puts more lives at risk than what is necessary. Now, he even brought it up himself. How do we quantify how much risk is acceptable? It's the same question I would ask David Seymour. How many deaths are acceptable?
Yeah.
How many injuries are acceptable? Are we offloading those costs to different ministries, or to things like ACC, which could, are we increasing prices of insurance? Are we increasing prices of healthcare in the future? What are we doing here? So we have to make sure that we're not kicking the can down the road to other ministries where it is not necessary to do so, because the best time to build and fix things is now, because inflation's only going to get worse. Now, again, I can understand and completely agree with him about, single story timber buildings, but that's not really what's in the scope of the argument here. We're looking at concrete buildings that are higher than 2 stories. So that's like your big apartments and whatnot. And it's so important we get the infrastructure right for that, because the risk, I mean, look, we can look at the impact of what happens when a concrete building with steel reinforcement falls down. Just have a look at the Twin Towers. Okay, I'm not saying that your local apartment building is the Twin Towers, but you can see how much damage that caused, because when a building falls down, it impacts.
I think the only structure that meets the height of what the Twin Towers would be in New Zealand would be the Sky Tower.
Yeah, but anyways, but we can look. We don't have to look. I mean, that's just that's a silly example that I brought up. But we can look at other buildings, like in other countries, where they've got weaker building standards than we do. What happens when a concrete building falls over, right?
Yeah,
or gets swept away by rain. And like some places in China, you look at tofu, what do they call them? Tofu dregs, tofu buildings. But what happens when they fall down? It's quite dramatic. We don't want that here. No. It's important that we don't lower our standards. But it is also really important, like I'm with Andy here, it's important that we have a level of flexibility so people can strengthen their buildings without breaking the bank. And I think there is another option in the RIS that does allow for that hasn't really been taken up by Chris Pink. which is the reason why I oppose this bill.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if there's always other options on the table that could potentially protect lives and provide more flexibility when it comes to fixing buildings, we should go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So Party Māori does not have a speech in there. Should we look at Dan Bidwar as a 1 minute seat warmer speech? Should we look at Camilla Bellich?
Yep.
Bill, I have to say. And the reason I'm taking call on this bill is because I am Labour's emergency management spokesperson. However, Madam Speaker, this is not an emergency management bill. It's coming from a very different perspective, and it's looking at how we assess risk and the very difficult decisions that we make in this House as legislators around what type of risk is acceptable for our people. And I do think this is very tricky. Like colleagues have said, like my colleague Adna Williams said, we will support this bill to select committee, but I don't think that means that there aren't outstanding questions in relation to this bill. And I echo the comments of my colleague in the Greens who mentioned looking back at this day and these decisions that we make in retrospect, and I think that responsibility should fall heavily on all of us in this House. The decisions that we make today around changing these requirements may or may not have impacts on the lives of others in the future. It may impact on people losing their lives, their livelihoods. These are tough, very tough choices. And I think the debate today has not perhaps reflected the gravity of that as much as it could have. I think the statement that David Seymour made was regretful. I think it is very, very difficult to speak to those who have lived through things like the Canterbury earthquakes, like my colleague Dr Duncan Webb, who have fought for people who have suffered the terrible life-changing consequences of the natural disasters which New Zealand is susceptible to, and made comments around the fact that those perspectives are not valid. They are valid, and we must take into account the seismic history of our country and the potential risks for the future. Madam Speaker, there is no choice which is no risk. Every choice we make in relation to these particular standards has a risk associated with it. But there is one certainty when we look at seismic activity in New Zealand, one certainty that we can be absolutely 100% sure of when we look at the history of our country, when we look at the science, when we look at the evidence, and that is that New Zealand will have significant seismic events in the future. That is absolutely 100% certain. And so when we look at changing these particular rules, we must do so knowing that the optimism bias that many of us have as humans, which is such a magical thing about humanity, we must balance that with the clear evidence that the reason we have this amazing geography in New Zealand, we have these beautiful high mountains and hills and lakes and everything that we see around us that we love so much about New Zealand, is because of the fact that we are living on a country which is filled with fault lines, and we can sometimes predict where those fault lines might activate, and sometimes we're right about that and sometimes we're wrong. And so it's probably a bit of a longer introduction than I was expecting to make on this short 5-minute call, Madam Speaker, but I do think it is important that in this House we recognise the gravity of our decisions in relation to these very, very important tasks. And I think, you know, the Minister has had a very tough task with this. I certainly think there can be improvements made at Select Committee. I think the situation in Auckland is very tricky, that I don't think the decision that he has come to is correct, in the sense that excluding it entirely is from my view, problematic. And the reason I say that is because although we don't have, as far as we know, the fault lines that other places in New Zealand have, we do have, obviously, a volcanic field. We know that there's a 10% chance of a volcano or some activity in the volcanic field in the next 50 years, which is a relatively short period of time. That comes along with ground deformation. Now, that is not shaking in the normal sense, but it is something which has an impact on the structures that we build upon. And so these are important decisions. I will not be, I'm not a member of the Select Committee that this bill is being sent to, but I encourage all colleagues that are on it to try and make this bill the best bill it can possibly be, because this is something that we will have to live with in years to come. And I hope that all of us take the necessary efforts to make sure that the decisions we make in this House and Select Committee are ones we can live at long term, not just for our children, but for our children's children and our children's children's children, because that is the reality of these types of bills, Madam Speaker.
Go.
Something a bit different, a bit refreshing. I'm glad Camilla's mentioning the fact about the volcanic activity in Auckland, the fact that, you know, the volcanic activity can actually cause changes in the ground, similar to earthquakes.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, she's definitely mentioning quite a few good points in there, and the fact that, you know, result of some of these changes, you know, emergency management would play a big part.
Yeah, I mean, I like the fact that she's brought up other things other than an earthquake.
Yeah.
I would go one step further and say, look, rainfall can also impact infrastructural integrity. There we go. That was the word I was looking for. Can also impact the integrity of buildings.
We can talk about that until the cows come home to Wellington.
Oh yes, I mean, yeah, you get some rot. Now it's more susceptible to falling down in an earthquake.
Every single there's so many different little things that have happened because of rain, but because they don't tend to close major arterial routes or months on end, they don't tend to make the national news.
Yeah, I mean, look, earthquake strengthening can overlap with a lot of other things like flood protection, right? Protecting your home from a flood. These things can be built in together. So it's not just about earthquakes, it's also about other things as well. And just so I'm not beating a dead horse, I'm not going to go back over what I said about climate change. But yeah, I mean, low risk is not no risk. That's a very important thing to bring up. And also we can look at Auckland as a whole. Auckland does not have the same level of risk right across the board, right? Yeah. There are going to be little pockets throughout Auckland that are going to be at a higher risk than other areas of Auckland. And I think that's also one of the other issues with this bill is that it's going, oh, yep, the entirety of Auckland is low risk. That is not necessarily true. You have to analyze the different areas within Auckland.
Put it this way, I would be scared to be in some type of earthquake near Piha. I can tell you that right now. Whereas I wouldn't be quite so worried about it if I was in Henderson.
Yeah. I mean, like another example close to home, Wellington. Some areas in Wellington are at higher risk if an earthquake hits than other areas of Wellington.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it be to structural reasons or be like they're on a slope of a hill or how close they are to the
one
ocean.
Morning coming across now, I'm not sure if it was, I think it was rain, I don't think it was an earthquake. But in Tia Road, sit there, come around the corner, and there's a slip.
Yep.
No cones, no nothing. Because it only just happened. It didn't happen while I was driving past, thank goodness. But the fact that I came around the corner and there wasn't even the cones out. Now that's telling you how fresh something has come down, and the fact that it hadn't been reported yet. And that was on the paper run. And it was because I normally come around up at that point and then straight down to deliver a paper to another address. So I had to reroute the paper run for that day. I went in, did the one and looked around and did it, and then came back around and worked my way through it. So I still did it, but it still got to that same address, so they still got their paper. And I remember when that slip occurred, I was still living in Kandahara. By the time that slip had its remedial work was in the last 2 years.
Yeah. You've highlighted it that different areas of Wellington are going to have different risks. Like even my town, Vikitahuna, has different amounts of risks. Like I'm in an area that's more high up than the opposite side of town, which is lower down and more prone to flooding, right? Yeah. So people go, oh, well, that's not the same as an earthquake. You need fault lines. But even in a region, right, some areas can be more heavily impacted or are going to feel the impact of an earthquake more than, say, the opposite side of the region.
Yeah.
Right? Regions in New Zealand are not tiny, not all of them.
Yeah.
So, people might be sitting up in Auckland and it's like, well, I've never felt an earthquake up while I was living up there. It doesn't matter. You've got other risks that you've also got to manage for. That earthquake strengthening also provides an overlap with.
Okay, let's get to the super chats. Lord Alex's super chats. First one. Just wanted Sam and Laura's opinion on Chris Luxon and Bishop's toning down on housing densification. I find it a bit disappointing and bitter. I think the Bush is trying to at least... He is more open to housing intensification than, say, Luxon is, by the sounds of it. And it's a bit of a shame because some areas it's clearly appropriate, like next to railway lines. But other areas, it's completely ridiculously stupid that it should not happen at all. It's a rock and a hard place. Like, well, where's appropriate, where's not? Like, if it's next to the Wairarapa line, in the case where you live, Alex, or next to North Island Main Trunk Line, which is, down on the going up State Highway 1 side, that would be more appropriate. But if it's saying in there, like, putting, say, housing density next to Laura's house, that's a complete joke. I mean, yes, there's a railway line, but it's still got wooden sleepers in it because there's so few trains that run on it. Yeah, it's one of those situations. you've got to have it where it best fits. And the great thing I do like about the Bush is the fact that he actually lives in an urban centre, and the fact that he's looks at things from an urban lens, not from a NIMBYism lens.
Yeah, so yeah, my answer to that is, again, like with Sam, it depends. It depends on what area we're talking about. Some areas are more, say, for example, ecologically sensitive. So intensification, like building up would be a better choice than, say, building out. But here, like in, say, in a rural area, right, intensification may be a detriment because we don't have the supporting infrastructure, like all the plumbing and everything. So already, we've had an increase in the amount of people that's moved here to Eke Tahuna. Our water infrastructure needs upgrading. Just today, we've had flooding in our waterways. We're on a boil water notice, right?
Yeah.
Because
I don't know when the last time I actually had to deal with boil water notice.
Yep. So at the moment,
I mean, put that along with power cuts, to me, aren't a normal thing for where I live in the country. Whereas compared to where Laura lives, both of those things happen probably. When did you last have power cut?
Oh, a couple months ago.
Yeah, exactly.
To run the
I'll be
generator?
honest, yes, I do remember a power cut in Newtown. My first power cut living in Wellington in 10 years. Yeah. Okay, let's get on to Super Chat number 2, also from Lord Alex of Super Chats. The other night, Chris Bishop announced submissions on the Petone Granada link will be open soon, and the route between Gilbert Bush and Seton Nosio Park can change. People are complaining about these routes.
This is kind of more in your area.
I know. It's like, I don't know how to respond to that, actually, to be honest, because it's just saying, there's consultation period.
Thank you so much for the $25 super chats. We really do appreciate all the super chats that come in. In response to that statement is, if you are going to be directly impacted by the construction of that infrastructure, please put in a submission. That is probably the best thing you can do. Because if you don't speak up, they don't know.
Exactly. And that's the thing there. It is quite a big piece of infrastructure to go through the area. And like the fact that the current proposal is building 2 tunnels, these things need to also be mentioned, is the fact that the Petone Granada Link Road is likely to become the default fuel tanker route for the North Island. So that would have to have fuel tanker capacity to be built into it. The good news is the fact that those 2 tunnels that are being proposed there don't tend to lead to a red traffic light at the end of it. So the safetiness that could happen to have that could mean that they will still get the green light for fuel tankers. That's something that is quite, considering the Petone Granada Link Road, with that road in there, it will take all the fuel tankers off Narrow Gorge if the road is built. But if it's not cleared for it, then it's going to keep it on the same local roads that we've got the problem with at the moment. Yeah. Okay, let's get off to our next bill, which is the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill, first reading, with Paul Goldsmith. No, not Paul Goldsmith. Chris Bishop with the Bush. Sorry,
and I think everybody in the media sector will be happy with that.
Thank you. That concludes oral questions. We'll take 30 seconds.
I was not expecting to be jump scared with that.
To leave the House quietly, without conversations on the way.
Yeah.
I presented a legislative statement on the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill.
The legislative statement is published under the authority of the House and can be found on the
Holy
Parliament
shit,
website.
Bishop.
The Honourable Chris
Can you
Bishop.
slow him
Mr.
down?
Speaker, I move that the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Finance and Expenditure Committee to consider the bill. Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 decades, house prices in New Zealand have increased more than any other OECD country. According to the OECD's Better Life Index, we ranked 40th out of 41 countries for housing affordability, just in front of the Slovak Republic. Our housing crisis has held us back economically and socially. As I've said many times, the government's determined to get on top of this problem by focusing on the fundamentals, treating housing as a complex and dynamic system. There are 3 pillars to our housing growth program. Pillar 1 is about freeing up land for development and removing planning barriers. Pillar 2 is about improving infrastructure funding and financing to support growth. Pillar 3 is about incentives to support growth. Pillar 1 includes housing growth targets, requiring them to enable 30 years of development capacity, enabling intensification and a greater mix of uses in the right places, and making greenfield growth easier. Mr. Speaker, members who have read or at least glanced so far at the planning bill that introduced to Parliament today, which will have its first reading next week, will notice that one of the aims or goals of the new system is competitive urban land markets. and that is an extremely important objective and goal for the system, and that is reflected in the bill we are reading for a first time today as well. Mr Speaker, Pillar 2 of the government's reforms relate to infrastructure funding and financing, and this is very important because you can have as much land supply and abundant development opportunities as you like, whether or not that's achieved through housing growth targets or more responsive land supply and land release mechanism in cities, which we're also proposing. But without the infrastructure and without the nimble infrastructure funding tools, the capacity will not be realised into ultimately houses. Pillar 2, Mr Speaker, is underway as well. We're publicly consulting on an exposure draft of the Local Government Infrastructure Funding Amendment Bill. This is to replace development contributions with a development levy system. The public consultation runs until February next year. The government intends to introduce legislation in mid-next year. The reality is, Mr Speaker, that under the status quo, councils and developers face significant challenges to fund and finance enabling infrastructure for housing. The government's aim is to move to a future state where funding and financing tools enable a responsive supply of infrastructure where it's commercially viable to build new houses. The aim is to shift market expectations of future scarcity, bring down the cost of land for new housing and improve incentives to develop land sooner rather than land banking. Brings us to the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which was established in 2020 by the previous government, picking up on work developed by the John Key and Bill English-led government in 2016 and 17. It's an alternative means to fund and finance infrastructure for urban growth. It involves the establishment of a special purpose vehicle to finance the infrastructure needed to enable development, repaid by levying the properties which benefit off council balance sheets. I think it would be fair to say, Mr Speaker, that the Act has fallen short of delivering infrastructure needed to respond to growth. Only 2 IFF Act levies have been established since 2020. This was a piece of legislation developed in a relatively bipartisan fashion, actually, as I say. Started life in the last national government, passed by Honourable Phil Twyford and friends in 2020. Has not quite worked out the way that people intended it to work out. So this amendment legislation makes some, I think, sensible amendments to allow it to be used more frequently in a cheaper way, in a way with less red tape. So the bill aims to remove unnecessary barriers to using the Act, improve the viability of it, to make the levy development and approvals process simpler and more streamlined. The improvements to infrastructure funding and financing reflects the government's overarching approach of growth paying for growth to enable more flexible provision of infrastructure that responds to development. As I said earlier, what we are trying to do is move to a system where there are abundant development opportunities and the funding and finance required to support those development opportunities is allowed to turn up and is not artificially constrained by artificial constraints on funding and financing in the same way that there are artificial constraints on land supply, which is what we have at the moment. And our future state will move to a world in which the economics of development dictate where and how it happens and when it happens, rather than artificial planning rules, which have held our cities back for too long and are the root cause of the housing crisis that has bedevilled New Zealand for too long, with all of the moral, fiscal, social implications that come from that. Fixing our housing crisis is going to take a long time. It is not something that can be done overnight. It is a complex system, but we are making good progress, picking up on some of the good work done under the previous government. So in terms of streamlining the levy approvals process, the extensive process required for applicants to have a IFF levy approved can be a barrier when trying to use the Act. So we are now simplifying requirements for levy proposals and recommendation reports, simplifying the mandatory considerations the Minister of Housing must take into account when assessing a levy, improving certainty for developer-led proposals by limiting council's ability to withhold the necessary endorsements where statutory requirements have been met, removing the requirement to assess a levy's affordability for these proposals supported by developers and all other existing landowners. For new developments, levy payers self-assess affordability and opt into the levy when deciding to purchase a property. As such, ministerial consideration of whether a levy is affordable is not needed if existing landowners are supportive. These things will make a difference, and I'm looking forward to seeing the feedback through the Select Committee to see whether or not we've got it exactly right. This bill will go to a Select Committee, and I've nominated the Finance Committee because I think that's the appropriate committee for it. The bill broadens the scope of the Act to improve its flexibility and viability for a range of infrastructure projects. This is really important. This will better reflect developer-led use of the tool and enable the Act to be used for transport projects delivered by the New Zealand Transport Agency or KiwiRail as part of a funding stack for transport infrastructure investment where it benefits property owners. Broadening the scope of the Act beyond simply addressing local authority funding and financing constraints aligns with wider transport system changes signalled in the government policy statement on land transport to require NZTA to consider alternative funding and financing arrangements for all new infrastructure projects to ensure that New Zealand delivers more infrastructure sooner. The simple proposition is this: if there is public expenditure on infrastructure projects that private landowners benefit from, and they are the beneficiaries of that expenditure, they should help to cover the costs of that expenditure.
It's a form of value capture, some would call it that. We prefer the term cost recovery. It doesn't actually matter what you call it. The proposition, or at least the value proposition, is a simple one. There's a lot of complexity to actually implementing it, but the changes we're making through the IFF Act amendment will allow that to happen. It will also enable the Act to be used for water infrastructure investments delivered by new water organisations delivered through the Local Water Done Well policy. The bill replaces the definition of community infrastructure, so it's not required to be owned or controlled by territorial authority. This broadens the potential use of the Act to include community infrastructure that is owned or controlled by a third party rather than vested in a territorial authority, and the bill will enable levy deferrals to help manage any affordability concerns and better support the use of the Act for the purposes of value capture or cost recovery. There's a variety of other changes to improve the Act, including clarifying a special purpose vehicle may commence recovery action if levies remain unpaid for more than 4 months, and amending the Local Government Rating Act to ensure that rates and levies rank equally in the event of a rating sale. Mr Speaker, this is an important series of changes, but it can't be divorced from the context of the flexible funding system we're trying to create for local infrastructure. This is one tool in the toolkit. It will be used, I think, for large new greenfield subdivisions on city fringes, where the economics of that development make sense. And I've already had some people say to me, well, I've had a look at the IFF, it doesn't work, it's too expensive. Well, that's okay. That's actually okay, because if the cost of the infrastructure and the special purpose vehicle doesn't make it economic to develop, or maybe we shouldn't be developing it. Actually, letting price signals diffuse themselves into land markets is actually part of the problem. Too often we've been cross-subsidising development in areas that don't make sense and not allowing those price signals to work effectively. So we may see it for greenfield subdivisions where people can make a buck out of it and the economics stack up, and we will also potentially use it for large new state highway projects in the future, or also, just in my last 25 seconds, the next time we do a city rail link project and we build a brand new $6 billion train station next to a casino, we should ask them to help cover the cost of the massive new infrastructure we've put into their private company. And we'll be able to do this with the changes. We'll be able to do this with the changes. We don't need a wealth tax, you just need sensible infrastructure funding tools. And I look forward to your support.
I love how he sat there and mentioned the point about Sky City Casino right there. Thank you, Bush.
I don't know, Bush. This seems like a pretty woke idea. I've got my Blue Greens hat on. We got a coalition of partial agreements here. Do you want to comment on this, mate?
I've made my comment. I like the fact that you mentioned the fact about I think it's Aotea train station being opening right next to Sky City Casino.
Okay.
Yeah, and he does mention a pretty damn good point about, maybe Sky City, who's going to have suddenly now this ability to have these people who can sit there and get to the casino in all sorts of different ways, and possibly on their gold card right outside the door of the casino. Maybe the casino should pay a targeted rate or a value captured, or was it value capture tax or a cost recovery tax or whatever you want to call it. Basically, they benefit from the changes. They should then contribute to it.
Okay, yeah, that is true. So I actually had to research what on earth he was talking about, because I'm not familiar with infrastructure funding. So what is the IFF Act and how does it work? So this is basically just a simple version that I wrote up to help explain to people. So for folks, think of this act kind of like, or this is an amendment act, but think of the original act as a build now, pay later financing tool for cities. So basically it means that instead of the council borrowing the money, a separate independent company is created called a special purpose vehicle, or SPV. The SPV borrows money from investors like banks to build the infrastructure. This debt is not on the council's books, so it doesn't affect the council's debt limit.
Yeah.
And then to repay the loan, the SPV charges a long-term levy or a special fee for up to 50 years to the properties that directly benefit from the new infrastructure. So like what you were saying, the casino or the new houses on the new road.
An example of that is Wellington City Council with the sludge plant.
The sludge plant.
That is the one that's out there, which is irated some people, even that their solution to the problem is that the people who are irated feel that the council should be allowed to breach environmental regulations and pump raw sewage out on the Cook Strait, which is completely wrong. But,
Yeah.
you've got some people who go, but I don't want to sit there and pay for that. I'd rather they pump it in water. It's not like I fish in the cook straight.
I don't know. Do you want people swimming in the poop water? Do you want your taxes
Oh.
to go up to pay for healthcare?
Exactly.
Yeah. So finally, to just finish my what the IFF does is that the council acts as the bill receptor. So adding the levy to the property owner's normal rates bills and passing the money onto the SPV. So yeah, that's basically how it works. Now, I went over the bill. I actually lost my notes, which is part of the reason why I came in here all frazzled. So I managed to restore some backup notes. Let me just go. There we go. Yep. So I have to go over omissions and whatnot. So and inaccuracies. This is something I've started to do with every speech. So for new developments, right, he says, for new developments, levy payers self-assess affordability and opt-in to the levy when deciding to purchase a property. It is misleading when he said that. It's a misleading statement. So the levy is actually a statutory charge attached to the property title, not an optional fee a buyer chooses at purchase. The opt-in is the decision to buy a property knowing the levy exists. And then we can talk about the omission in his speech. He failed to mention that the cost barrier or the high transaction cost of SPV financing is largely unaddressed by these legislative changes. So the RIS states legislative changes will have minimal impact on the first barrier or the cost, focusing only on the second process, which is talking about how much things cost and whatnot. So yeah, we can look. Chris correctly diagnoses the IFF's Act's failure, and the bill is a direct implementation of the HUD's. So that's the government consultation group recommended fixes from the RIS. Clause 17 in the bill enacts simplified assessment criteria by removing affordability analysis for land owning supported proposals. Clause 5 broadens the definition of responsible infrastructure authority to include state enterprises. So that's like Waka Kotahi infrastructure projects. However, Chris Bishop's characterization of opting in underplays the compulsory long-term nature of the levy. So the RIS is pretty clear that these process fixes alone may not solve the core problem of high transaction costs relative to council debt, meaning that the tool may remain economically unviable for some projects.
Okay, let's get on to Karen McAnulty.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call on the Honourable Karen McAnulty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard from the infrastructure and the local government sector a very clear message that they want some certainty. They want to see an end to the stop-start carry-on that they have seen over the last couple of years. And today is a particularly important day to point that out because it is relevant to this bill. We're hearing a lot today around how much the government's proposed changes to the Resource Management Act will make things better, but no mention of the fact that it was this government that put us back to the old RMA that was no longer fit for purpose. Now, I'm pleased that the government is not following the approach where there was a reform, they scrapped the reform, went back to the old approach, then used that as justification for the fast track, then bypassed proper parliamentary procedure and public feedback to pass that bill. At least they haven't scrapped the original Infrastructure Funding and Finance Act and started again. That is a positive. And it gives us an opportunity as a Labor Party to be able to indicate that we will support this bill to Select Committee because it does build on what was intended by the 2020 Act. And it is true that only two levies have gone through the process as a result of that. And it is quite clear that there are some barriers to establishing those. We would like to see more occur because at the end of the day, many councils are at their debt ceiling. Even with the changing of that ceiling by this government, they will be under significant financial strain. That is particularly true with this bungled water reform by this government and the additional requirements that they have placed on council and the government's inability or unwillingness to consider alternative revenue streams for councils outside rates. And let's not fall into the trap of thinking that a rates cap is going to be the silver bullet here. It's in many cases going to make things more difficult. And in fact, this is potentially the only way in which that some areas will be able to go through some infrastructure projects because, frankly, council's hands will be tied behind their back. But what is of concern, Mr Speaker, is the lack of consultation that was delivered as part of the development of this bill. Now, it's been a couple of years, and frankly, the changes that are in this bill have been signalled by ministers for some time. So it is quite telling that if you look through the departmental reports and the regulatory impact statements, it's quite clear that departments did not have enough time, they say so themselves, to assess this and actually understand whether the changes that are being proposed here will actually deliver what the ministers just outlined. It's very difficult as a parliament for us to assess a piece of legislation when departments haven't been given enough time to actually look at what is being proposed and give Parliament a steer as to whether it's going to work. It's quite telling that they only consulted with a hand-picked select few of councils, not councils across the board and not local government New Zealand. They could argue that they only talk to those councils that are at their debt ceiling already, but as we know, many, many more are predicted to fall into that situation, and they will indeed be interested in the provisions that are proposed in this bill. It is also interesting and worth noting that the government hasn't consulted with iwi on this bill, despite the fact, even though the minister's speech didn't touch on this bill actually proposes quite significant changes to how Māori land is viewed and considered as part of this process. Now, I am pleased that it is going to Select Committee because we will work constructively with the government to look to improve this bill, but we will have questions around that. The expansion of this to include transport is worthy of pretty detailed assessment. We want some assurances that the changes that are being proposed around Māori land in particular do not disadvantage those shareholders in that land given their unique status, unlike any other shareholders of land holdings in this country, and of course the responsibilities of the Crown through Te Tiratia Waitangi. It is essential that we get those reassurances, and I'm not sure enough consideration has been given to changing the requirement for a levy to be linked to a specific project. We're keen to dive into those at Select Committee, so we're happy to support it to there, Mr Speaker, but we're keen to look into it more.
You can see I changed my hat because I agree with Karen McAnulty. Yeah, I mean, look, going over my notes again. Let's go down here.
Yeah, your hats.
And my hats, yes. Okay, so yes, he accurately went over what was in the RIS, having briefly and quickly read over it before the show started. There was a significant lack of consultation or no consultation with iwi Māori. He is correct. And he even references the RIS's own consultation. So what he said there when he said that, yep, we had time constraints. He is correct. Broader consultation would have been desirable. That's in the RIS. And officials are yet to engage with iwi Māori on changes to the IFF Act. So within the bill, particularly clauses 9 and 14, make material changes to the definition of and consent requirements for protected Māori land. You'd think if you're going to put in those types of changes in the amendment bill, you want to consult with iwi Māori, right? Because you're talking about, you know, changing the definition and consent requirements for protected Māori land. So this lack of consultation with iwi Māori is a significant procedural and potentially Treaty of Waitangi violation that the Select Committee now has to rectify. So, you know, I'm sorry, Bish, you didn't consult enough people.
Yeah, well, you know, no surprises there. Probably he wanted to. He probably was overruled by Luxon.
Yeah, you just had to basically just rush it through. But yeah, it's not good. You're going to get a lot of angry Māori people in the Select Committee.
Yeah, that's the thing. You're going to get a lot of that. Yeah. Okay, Julian Genter, my local MP.
The Honourable Julian Genter.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koutou e te whare. The Minister in his speech referred to enabling more greenfields development. And I think I have to fundamentally disagree with his assertion that that is necessary or desirable for Aotearoa New Zealand. We have known now for decades, there has been study after study that has quantified the infrastructure costs associated with greenfields development significantly higher. The places we need homes and businesses and schools and everything else now is within the existing urban area, close to good quality public transport in walkable neighbourhoods. That is what will deliver for Aotearoa New Zealand. And the people opposite are actually just a bunch of walking contradictions, Mr. Speaker, if I could. Like, everything they say, the government, is a walking contradiction, because they say that they want things to be value for money and they want taxes to be low, and at the same time, they have a wish list of outrageously expensive highway projects, which are not actually going to improve productivity at all, but would probably facilitate a lot of suburban sprawl. So, like, the one kind of coherent thread that links what the government is doing is that they're doing what land bankers want. And it's those people who own farmland that is somewhere out near Auckland who are going to benefit from the government investing in highways because they'll be able to sell off that land as houses. Will New Zealanders benefit from that? Well, no, those neighbourhoods will be neighbourhoods where people do not have good, affordable access to the amenities that they need to live good lives. Overall, our country will be spending more on fuel and private vehicles, we'll have higher emissions, more air pollution, more sedentary lifestyles. All of that is cost. And it actually doesn't make people happy. And it doesn't benefit the economy, but it does benefit some vested interests. And that's why you can guarantee that the coalition government will be doing something, is to help those vested interests make more and more money at the expense of public good and our TIO, our environment, and our climate. So when it comes to infrastructure funding and financing, like, the whole thing is a very complex new structure that tries to get around the fact that if we want to have more infrastructure, we have to pay for it. And as much as they say, well, we'll internalize the cost of that infrastructure, when does that ever happen? It's not happening. And if it did, if people actually had to pay the cost of the infrastructure, it would be hugely unaffordable, and they would choose not to develop there. They would choose not to live in those places. That's the truth. It's quite simple. Now, if, we're going to support this bill to select committee, and we did support when the previous government did it, but ultimately, what they're trying to get at is the idea that public infrastructure needs to be paid for by a group of people who benefit from it, which is actually the public, and that's what taxation is meant to do. And if you are using more direct pricing mechanisms, and if we were doing that, we certainly wouldn't be prioritizing the highways they're prioritizing. We wouldn't be prioritizing greenfield growth, because we have quantified the cost and it is unaffordable. What we need government to be focusing on is removing the barriers to building density done well in our existing urban areas, investing in high quality, fast, frequent, affordable, free public transport, in rail and electric bus services, linking up our communities across the moto as we once had. And that would all make sense. And when you go to other countries, and I appreciate that many people here won't know what the rest of the world is doing, but if you go to other countries that we aspire to be like, they have much higher use, much higher investment in public transport, in walkable, cyclable neighborhoods. They do have more community-driven development of mixed-use neighborhoods, which here, it's like, in New Zealand, it's like, let the landowner dictate how the city develops, which is crazy. It just doesn't deliver what people need to live good lives. People need to be walking distance from schools, walking distance from public transport shops. And the big lie is they claim that this is all about choice. Rubbish. It is not about choice.
A point of order, Simon Court.
I don't mean to interrupt the member, because she is quite economically coherent on most matters, but she's just referred to members of the governing parties as liars. I object to that. It's unparliamentary. It's going to bring the House into disorder.
Speaking to the point of order.
Yes.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that members might be feeling sensitive, but I'd said the big lie, not accusing someone of being a liar at all. The big lie is a more general thing about the idea that cars give independence and freedom.
Yeah, well...
It's an expression.
I think it's a debating point. You've got 22 seconds left.
So, people have not chosen this. This is something that benefits an overseas industry that sells motor vehicles and fossil fuels to us at high cost, that actually drains our country's productivity, makes our air dirtier, our water dirtier. It's the source of all the microplastics in the oceans, and it costs us a whole lot of money. And the grains of a better solution.
Thank you, Jerry, for the advertising allocation at the end of that.
He handled that well, because that point of order was literally, boom, did I hear liar? Oh, heck. Yeah, and it's typical. Like, if you see the one who does most point of orders for ACT, you typically see it from Simon Court.
Yeah.
And it's usually about the Greens.
Yeah. Speaking of the Greens, I'm probably going to get a phone call after this, but because I do have a point of... Anyways, let's just go over the notes. Here we go. Back over my notes. Okay, that I managed to restore. Right. I do have some nitpicking to do with Jag, and I like Jag, and I know she's probably just going to go, right, I'm going to wait. I'm looking forward to debating Laura. But anyways, I've just got to bring up two things. So there is one inaccuracy in that speech. She suggested that the bill itself prioritizes greenfield and highways. Technically, the bill is agnostic. it makes the funding tool available for any eligible infrastructure. So the prioritisation happens through other instruments, so GPS on land transport, NPS, UD. So the bill could equally fund brownfield water pipes or a metro station. There is also one noted omission, and this is, to be fair, guys, this is real nitpicking, right? It's like the omission that was made here, that she did make here, is that she does not engage with the bill's potential positive use for value capture on public transport projects, like the City Rail Link example, which the minister mentioned. Again, this is real nitpicking from me. Apart from that, I didn't have a problem with her speech.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on to Mr. Interrupter, Simon Court. Yeah, that can be his new name. Simon Interrupter Court.
Oh, don't worry, his speech is worse.
Simon Court.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's first reading of the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill is about fixing one of the biggest handbrakes on New Zealand's growth: how hard it is to get infrastructure built when and where communities need it. The original Act came out of a rare moment of genuine innovation. A developer found a practical way to deliver the infrastructure for the Milldale development without being trapped by council debt limits or funding constraints. It should have set the standard for how we fund future growth. Instead, the Act has barely been used. It's been weighed down by process, bureaucracy, too many chances for delay or obstruction by those who don't carry the cost of saying no. This bill removes those barriers so more projects can get off the ground. It expands who can use the Act, improves viability of a wider range of infrastructure, and simplifies the levy and approval process so the tool becomes practical instead of theoretical. The bill widens access to the Act, extending it to new water organisations like Local Water Done Well, and to transport projects covered by NZTA and Kiwirail. New Zealand has a massive backlog of infrastructure needed to support growth. If the people who benefit can pay through a levy, these projects can move sooner rather than waiting for councils' balance sheets to catch up. The bill also makes sure developer-led proposals get a fair run. When developers meet statutory requirements, councils will be required to endorse them, instead of finding new ways to stall those projects. That certainty has been missing for far too long. We also introduced levy deferrals, giving flexibility where affordability concerns arise, and better supporting use of the Act for cost recovery purposes. The current levy process is so complex it puts people off before they begin. This bill fixes that by enabling levy orders to be made directly on the terms of the levy proposal itself, removing duplication and simplifying the process for developing a recommendation report, simplifying mandatory considerations of the Minister of Housing, cutting paperwork and the evidence burden placed on applicants, removing the ministerial affordability assessment, where developers and all existing landowners agree to the proposal, removing the need for an infrastructure endorsement, where the infrastructure will not vest in a responsible authority, making the Act far more workable for developer-led and owned assets. These remove real-world costs, time delays, and the friction that currently kill the momentum that will actually get more homes delivered sooner. The bill also provides several targeted fixes to the Act to make it usable on the ground. These include providing special purpose vehicles clear authority to begin recovery action if levies remain unpaid for more than 4 months, allowing infrastructure to be completed for up to 2 years before a levy proposal is submitted, because sometimes developers work much faster than the system they're forced to work within. This will ensuring councils can recover reasonable administrative costs when providing endorsements on these proposals, refining the definition of protected Māori land so that relevant land can be identified from publicly available information rather than forcing proposers to spend potentially months and a whole lot of money to identify records that are almost impossible to find. The new changes will prevent double dipping by ensuring levies and development contributions cannot fund the same infrastructure more than once, expanding how leviable land categories may be defined, including developed or undeveloped status, floor area, or categorising land at a fixed point in time. Together with minor and technical improvements, these changes finally make the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act a practical tool. They give developers, councils and central government clearer rules, better incentives and far fewer avenues for delay. Combined with the government's Going for Housing growth program, this bill helps build a system that actually supports flexible, demand-led growth instead of resisting it at every turn. Mr. Speaker, this bill cuts through obstacles and enables people who want to build to actually get on with building. That's how we fix what matters for New Zealanders. More homes, more infrastructure where we need it, delivered without the bureaucratic drag that has kept this country back. I commend this bill to the House.
Yeah, talking about holding Kiwis back, I'm pretty sure there was a news article that came out recently about David Seymour saying no to a bunch of infrastructure being built in Epsom because it's like, oh, you've got these people that are going to be staring down on my neighbour's swimming pools. So it's like, okay,
yeah, I know. It's quite interesting of the one of what do you call it? Julianne, you're wrong about opposing the second terrace tunnel. But Julianne, don't suggest about putting what do you call it, high-rise buildings with cycle lanes outside in the Epsom electorate. I don't approve of that.
Yeah. I look. There's a reason why I don't have a woke hat with ACT Party colours on it because I just can't agree with them. I've only agreed with them once last year, and that was over the Arms Amendment Bill. Because they correctly identified that the original bill's a mess and it needs cleaning up. Yay! But everything else has been pretty shit, to put it quite bluntly. Now, let's go over the inaccuracies or the omissions that were made in that speech.
The floor is yours.
Sorry, the floor is mine. Okay, yay. Yes. Okay, so inaccuracy. Okay, so he stated that removing ministerial affordability assessment where developers and all existing landowners agree to the proposal, this is overbroad. The bill, clause 17, with the new section 27A, removes the requirement for the minister and recommender to consider affordability only if all existing landowners provide written support. This is a high bar, especially for brownfield areas. And then we've got an omission from him. He does not acknowledge the trade-off identified in the RIS. So streamlining and removing affordability checks for supported proposals increases speed, but reduces a layer of independent protection for future homeowners and occupiers. But the biggest omission, which he was actually celebrating in his speech, was redefining what protected Māori land is. And it is pretty gross when you stand up and you celebrate that the bill's going to do that when you haven't done the consultation with iwi Māori.
Exactly. And what happens when it goes wrong, not if, when, because that's the thing that people seem to sit down there and go, will come out with ignorant style answers such as "don't just let it get wrong" or something like that. They won't acknowledge the when it goes wrong factor. They just, don't let it go wrong. Well, don't let it go wrong while taking a step that prevents it going wrong. So it steams straight through like a freight train about to derail, and you have a sign go, pull down your whistle and turn up your speed, and you won't derail, and bang, it comes completely off the tracks.
Yeah. Look, I know that me going over inaccuracies and omissions might sound a little bit petty, and to be honest, that's because, there's only one really obviously glaring issue with this legislation, right? Because this original IFF, or the Infrastructure Funding Act, that was a Labour Party bill. So there's, you've got National essentially coming in and trying to build on top of it. So the foundation of this is not terrible, but it's what's not being acknowledged here, or what's being what's the word I'm looking for? Okay, I don't have the right. I don't have the right word for it at the moment. But yeah, the omissions that are being done here, like the lack of consultation with iwi Māori, that's a big one. That's a really big one, and the selective consultation that was done with certain industries, and the fact that there wasn't really wider public consultation on this when it was in the development stage. That's an issue. That's an issue for me.
Yeah. Okay, let's get on to Uncle Andy for our last speech of the night.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is one of many initiatives being made by this government to make it easier, cheaper, faster and more certain to get things built and delivered in New Zealand. And Mr. Speaker, we have to raise our productivity. That is what ultimately this is all about. If we're going to have a higher quality of living, a higher standard of living, if we're going to be able to deliver the public services that we want to deliver, we have to raise our productivity. It doesn't grow on trees. We can't borrow that living standard. We can't borrow those services, as some in the opposition benches seem to want us to do. Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders have been trying to deliver that higher productivity with a ball and chain wrapped around our collective ankles. This bill is part of reducing that barrier. It means we're talking about today, we'll be talking about making consenting easier. We're also talking here about making the financing and funding and delivering of infrastructure easier and cheaper. Industry and business know this. This government knows this. Not quite sure if all of the opposition know it, but they keep on complaining, Mr. Speaker, about workers going to, particularly in the construction industry, leaving for Australia. And one of the things they don't seem to realise is that every time we remove, in this government, we remove a barrier that helps more construction happen, that is helping to keep those people here in New Zealand. And Mr. Speaker, actually it was a real delight to be on the West Coast recently to visit a number of mines and to see that there were a number of the people working in those mines who have come from Australia to work in New Zealand because we are providing employment opportunities in New Zealand, in this case on the West Coast, which I know is a place very familiar to you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill is about helping to provide funding through making the IFF process easier and less bureaucratic, as we've already heard. But at the moment, it's only been used in 2 places in New Zealand, and that obviously shows the barrier that there is there. 2 final things to say. First is a note of caution. The Bill's general policy statement says that the IFF Act was introduced to help deliver infrastructure projects free from local authority funding and financing constraints. Well, I note that we are also, as a government, trying to make sure that we keep a lid on rates rises. What we don't want to do is to see IFF being used as a way around rates rises and the limitations that there are on council raising money, because there's a limitation on how much money they can take from their ratepayers, which we want to make sure there is a limitation. And the second one is that as the Minister introduced this, he talked about growth paying for growth, and that's a really, really important concept. When we had the Infrastructure Commission in front of the Transport and Infrastructure Committee during Scrutiny Week, they told us, in answer to questions, that growth at the moment is paying for something between 30 and 50% of the costs of growth. That means growth is nowhere near paying for growth. And that means that the costs of that growth at the moment are landing on existing ratepayers, consumers, taxpayers, and that's something that needs to change. And actually, I was surprised by the comments made by Julianne Genter in this debate, talking about greenfields development, and then somehow it's a bad thing that that happens, and saying that somehow linking it with the Transport Agency and Kiwirail. But what this specifically does is it allows the possibility that the likes of New Zealand Transport Agency, the likes of Kiwirail, can say, look, we've built some infrastructure which allows some development to happen, and we are going to charge the beneficiaries of that development for some of that cost. That is growth paying for growth. That's been a hole in the system for a very, very long time. It's a great thing that we moved to fix that. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to this bill progressing, and I commend it to the House.
Yeah, rates caps. I think it's really interesting that he's identified that this could be, that
a way to circumvent rates caps.
Yeah, basically work around the rates caps. It is an interesting point. Like, you have to ask then, why are councils looking to circumvent rates caps?
Yeah.
Via this route, and is it because that the rates caps
are going to not work?
Yeah, are going to not work, to put it quite simply. Like I agree with the logic that he's put forward, but the argument, like, you have to sit there and go, well, why are councils looking to do this? Is there something else that, that's happened, like the rates caps, that's resulting in councils having to go down this route? Like, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, look, there's a leak in the system we made that's trying to solve a problem that we've created. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like the fact that councils' tools are literally basically, with their heads tied behind their backs, only being able to really collect rates.
Yeah, it's kind of like what would be a good example I could think of? It's kind of like with WINS not declaring wages. Because you're worried that you're going to get kicked off your benefit. When I used to work in shearing, that was often a common thing. People just not declared their wages; they got paid under the table because they would have their money taken off them if they had declared their wage. It kind of reminds me of that. Like, why are they holding back, not declaring their wages? Is it because they're not earning enough to cover?
Or is the system just too complex?
Yes.
Yeah. Like the great example of WINS is the fact that you've got to report the wages on Friday for work that you don't know what hours you've done on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to since it's 9:59, and you said there's that phone call going to be coming in, so let's get to the final bits of the show. Submissions that will be available for you to put in your submissions on. The Public Works Amendment Bill closes in 2 days' time on Tuesday, the 27th of January. The Emergency Management No. 2 Bill closes on Tuesday, the 3rd of February. The Budget Policy Statement closes on the 4th of February. The Commerce Promoting Competition and Other Matters Amendment Bill closes on the 4th of February. The Planning Bill and Natural Environments Bill closes on the 13th of February. The Arms Bill closes on the 16th of February. The Crime Amendment Bill closes on the 16th of February. The bill we covered earlier today, the Building Earthquake Prone Amendment, Building Amendment Bill closes on Monday the 16th of February. The Infrastructure Funding and Financing Amendment Bill closes on Friday the 20th of February. And the inquiry into the 2025 local body election closes on the 27th of February.
I just want to say before we head off, thank you everyone for dealing with me tonight. I don't know what's been going on. I've been kind of a bit frazzled today, and it's really playing on with my dyslexia. Like, I've been having trouble reading things out loud. That normally doesn't happen to me. I'm usually pretty good with that. But yeah, I kind of literally before the show, my audio didn't work. I lost half of my notes. So I was like, came in here absolutely frazzled. So I know that I've probably got some things wrong tonight. That does happen. So don't be afraid to fact check me if I get stuff wrong in the chat. Absolutely do that. But yeah, thanks for hanging out with us tonight.
No problem. And tomorrow I will be the person doing the live streaming for the Fabian show with the Independent Foreign Policy. And I do believe that one of the guest speakers is Tiana Tuiono.
Oh, nice.
So I've posted the link in there. So if you want to watch the Fabians tomorrow, it will be at 5:30 p.m. on the New Zealand Fabian Society YouTube channel. Yes.
Say hi to him for me.
I'll pass it on. Yes, yeah. Okay. Sorry, we don't know what we're going to be doing next week. However, from tonight's poll on the show, 50% of the people believe that the House will go into urgency this week, and 50% don't. The one interesting thing to point out is the fact that there are select committee hearings next week. So the likelihood of going into urgency is probably less likely, and it's more likely to be extended sittings, which is, should we just say, it's not quite urgency. Anyone knows me knows that I don't like urgency.
Oh, I hate it. Yeah.
Yeah. I prefer extended sittings because extended sittings doesn't skip the parliamentary process. Okay, we'll get moving and we'll see you back at 8 p.m. To next Sunday for more from the Order Paper Podcast.
Thank you for watching The Order Paper, your express ticket to the New Zealand House of Representatives. Every episode, we unravel the complex world of legislation, debate, and democracy. From bills to select committees, we've got it all covered. From our team of political commentators who will dissect and explain what's happened so you can remain up to date on what's happened in the Aotearoa, New Zealand Parliament. To support our channel, you can become a Patreon member at patreon.com/it'sintheballot. The Order Paper Podcast is brought to you by It's in the Ballot Productions.